I'm Chance Storland, and in San Antonio, military means local. This is Military City, a new podcast from expressnews.com, where each week myself and San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen discuss military issues important to the country and also important to San Antonio. Of course, Sig Christensen was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has reported on military-related topics for decades. Sig, great to have you back here on the program. We have talked about several different topics so far. We're just early on into this new podcast, Military City. And today, I'm really glad we're tackling this topic. And it's a bit strange because, we're both men, but you, of course, bring a lot of military knowledge, military history to the table. And some of that is from the past, but like today's story, this is one that we're focusing more on present day. And specifically, we're focusing on women in the Air Force. Tell me about it.
Yes, the RAND folks up in Washington did a study for the Air Force. And in the study, what they were looking at was the fact that a lot of women leave the ranks. Officers we're speaking about in particular here. So a lot of female officers leave the ranks when they're captains or majors, and there aren't very many women in the ranks at 06, which is the designation for colonel, 07, the designation for brigadier general, where you see a lot of men, and the military generally is male-dominated. You see many more of them at those ranks than you should, and so women are not really well represented at the highest ranks of the Air Force, and that has created some concern. There is a belief that diversity is important. It matters in part because it creates diversity of thought. And it also, of course, comes down to the Air Force wanting to ensure that people who have talent stay in the Air Force. That's really important. And so we recently talked to 3 female pilots who are in the Air Force, and they're going to try to stay for at least 20 years. That will be a bit on the unusual side. A lot of women won't stay that long. They frequently leave at 14 years or 12 years. In particular, for pilots, they have an opportunity to leave at 12 or 13 years or so. Their pilot commitment ends, and they can simply say, I'm checking out. And some of them do that. And if this goes on long enough, though, you end up having a fraction of 1%, for example, who might become 1-star generals. There aren't very many of them out there. Most of the generals are white men. So what you've got is an attempt by the Air Force to begin changing that. And they're basically using the RAND report as a springboard for instituting a number of changes that'll help, in theory at least, will help the Air Force keep women in the service. So a quick note on what the problems are. One of the big problems, they don't do things in the Air Force or the other services that are terribly family friendly. So, for example, they have childcare development centers on bases, but there are waiting lists to get your kids into those centers. It's hard to believe, but you really do have a waiting list, and so a pilot and his wife coming here to San Antonio to fly at Randolph, they have 2 CDCs that they can enroll their kids in. But if they have a waiting list at both of those CDCs, they have to then look off in the economy, as they call it, off base, to find childcare. That's not easy either, because guess what? Childcare off base is as tough to find as it is on base. And they have orders. So they come here, for example, to train people how to fly. And so they're going to be instructor pilots, or they're going to run some office involving instructor pilots. And that really creates trouble, because when you got orders, you've got to follow them. This isn't just an option. You have to go to work. You have to fly the pilots. You have to train them. You're responsible for them. And I heard today something really fascinating. When there is a crash, involving a pilot, a mishap, as they call it. The Air Force investigates all the way back to whoever trained that pilot. So they actually scrutinized whether the training was good or bad, or whether it was just routine. So you're on the hook as an instructor, and you have to do your job. But you also have kids. How do you make that work? We talked with 3 pilots, as I said, who tried to explain it. And one that is on the podcast today, Lieutenant Colonel Allison Patrick, does a great job of laying into some of the big issues.
And so let's get to that specific individual. You spoke with her in depth, and we're going to have 3 cuts of that audio like we usually do here on Military City. It's great because we have this conversation, but I believe in every episode we've had really, really good cuts of audio that really bring home what we're talking about. So let's get to that first clip. And so Lieutenant Colonel Paddock, she told you about the part of the RAND report that echoed most with her, and that's really in line with what we just discussed now.
Yes, it's childcare. That's a big, big deal. And, it's not just an issue if you are in CONUS, which is the military acronym for Continental United States. If you deploy overseas and you've got kids, you need childcare. They have childcare on the bases overseas, but the hours don't always mix and match. And that's a problem, not just there, but here. And so we're talking about pilots who have busy lives. In Allison's case, she and her husband are both A-10 pilots. So that's a pretty serious aircraft. That's a combat airplane used for close air support. They have lots of time in the airframe, and they have to do their jobs, and they're very good at it. But they also have 2 children, Zane, who is 10, and Finn, who is 5. And that is where the conflict starts.
Childcare issues I have definitely dealt with multiple times over the course of my career, especially with PCSs, trying to find quality childcare, sometimes not knowing anything about the area and, without CDC availability, sometimes just almost picking I wouldn't say at random, but, having to just pick something that was available so I would have it available so I could start working right away, essentially, because it's not like I can just wait around for a couple months till I find the, childcare that I want to start working. I'm expected to be ready to go, essentially day one. So sometimes that put my children in less than optimal situations, which was pretty tough as a mom to see, because a couple of them were, I would say, particularly bad. But a lot of times moves generated a lot of those issues. And then the other one that was a challenge for us, we PCS'd to Korea. My husband and I were both flying A-10s there, and we had our first son then, who was almost 2. And moving there, we didn't know until just a few weeks before we showed up that we were going to have a slot at the CDC. And so that was a tremendous amount of stress, not moving to a foreign country and then having absolutely no idea who was going to watch our son. Was really stressful. And then even then, the CDC hours didn't reflect reality as far as our schedules. And so we had to constantly, make sure that our flying schedules were offset. So one of us was available for drop-off and pickup, and then we had to coordinate other special arrangements anytime we had exercises or night flying or things like that. So that definitely caused some headaches and a lot of consternation along the way.
And SIG, of course, says it really shouldn't be any surprise for anyone who's listening right now. When someone's working, when they're professional, when any type of position that they have, when that position, affects their children negatively, puts them in jeopardy, however you want to describe that, that obviously is going to have a huge toll on their parents. And that's certainly the case here with Lieutenant Colonel Paddock.
Yes, and I think this is where loyalty between country and family really gets difficult. I mean, it becomes a hard thing to manage because there are a lot of things that as a soldier or an airman or a Marine or sailor, you just got to suck. You got to deal with it. People in the war zone call it embracing the suck. So you know that you've just got to deal with it, and so you do it. You go to war, you embrace the suck. You got a long day, you embrace the suck. It isn't any fun, but they know that if it's a lawful order, they have to follow it, and they're signed under the law to a contract. So it's all serious business, and there are no options when you get an order. So you follow it. But when your kids start becoming the victims of the government's needs, the government's need to use you in a certain way, then that really does rub people the wrong way. And it can rub people so much the wrong way that first chance they get, they bail out and they leave the military because they want their kids protected. And that's what Allison is going to talk about here.
I think that one's, in my opinion, probably the most troubling, or the most, I don't know, the one that causes the most consternation, because anything that affects your kids, I mean, that's like, do whatever you want to me, but don't mess with my kids, and that's when it's tough, is when, the military is doing things and telling you to go places and do things that impacts your kids. I think that is really tough. I know for a lot of them, too, family separation is a big issue, when spouses are separated for extended periods. I have not had significant issues with that myself. My husband and I have been very fortunate that we haven't had large periods of separation. So I know for a lot of people that is a huge concern. I have just been fortunate enough to not have to deal with that in large amounts. And the same with deployments, too. I mean, I've not had to deploy that much over my career, not because I was avoiding them, but it's just the way things have worked out with assignments and stuff. But I know certainly had I been in a career, or, just assignments that I was deploying more, that would have made it much more challenging to stay in.
And so, Sig, now that we've heard from Lieutenant Colonel Allison Paddock multiple times so far in the podcast, we have one more clip. And this is really important because, we're talking about childcare and how children affect, females in the Air Force, something that you've already mentioned, something the Air Force doesn't want to get rid of. They want them to join. They want them to keep serving as long as they possibly can, especially when they're a very vital asset like a pilot. So we need to break it down a little bit more, I think, and that involves around, what is your daily life like? What is your day-to-day, a typical day as a woman with children in the Air Force? And you spoke to her specifically about that.
Yes, and she talks about this whole business as being a balancing act. And it's a hell of an act. You don't really understand how busy these people are until you see what she's about to tell you. We're talking about a pilot who's got 2,700 hours in the A-10 and the T-38. Those are jets, very fast aircraft. They're very skilled people, and they're well educated. So we're talking about folks who have all kinds of abilities here. But after they get through juggling the stuff they do at work, their home is perhaps as complicated as the office. And what we're going to talk about here is how she manages to cram a lot into a day, and how much of that revolves around her boys.
I mean, I can give you an example of, what a typical day might look like a week or two ago, and that's, my husband right now with his job is out of town a lot during the week, and so I'm a single parent a lot of the time. So, I get up, I have to get the kids to school in the morning, then I come to work, I do my work day, I pick them up, I take them to get food as quickly as we can, because I have to, I'm trying to maximize my time at work, but I also have commitments with my sons to get them to practice because they play sports. And so I feed them as quickly as I can. I take them to sports, and some nights, we don't get home till 8 o'clock or later, and then It's me getting them to bed. And then a lot of times it's, at some point in that evening, whether it's at their ball practice or later when I get home, going back and checking my, work email to see, what I might have missed since I left the office. And then rinse, repeat the next day. And that is a lot when it's day after day after day after day.
And then finally, Sig, of course, we've done a very good job with this audio of your conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Allison Paddock, describing why this is such a big deal, why women are leaving the Air Force because of, childcare and other issues that were covered in this survey. Where does that leave the Air Force now? I mean, obviously, this information is out there. You're reporting on it. They have the information from this survey. I assume they would want to fix it, but when you think of the military, that doesn't often mean quick changes. So what's the next step? How does this get fixed?
That's an excellent question. First thing I can tell you is that one way it gets fixed is when you have a 4-star general who is the Air Force Chief of Staff saying, this is a priority, do something about it. That is how things get fixed quickly. Now, some of these things won't be fast fixes. Some of what Rand has recommended has not been put in place yet, but some other things already have happened. So just to give you one example, in the past, women who were pregnant had to do a PT test 6 months after they delivered. That's awfully fast. The Defense Department has changed that. So now you have a year. That gives you actual time to begin working out. You don't have to rush it. And you've got lots of other things that you're trying to manage. Say you've had twins. And so we've got a couple in the story that did have twins. You've got a whole bunch of juggling to do right there. And that's just one example, though. One of the things that I'm not sure they can fix are PCSs, permanent changes of station. So we've got a couple here, the one who is a pilot, the woman, and her husband, who works at a camera exchange shop in San Antonio. Every time she goes to a new assignment, and she moves every 2 or 3 years, he loses his job. And he has to go and search for another one. He managed to get a job fairly quickly when they lived in Mississippi, but when they took a 3-week honeymoon, which was after they had married, sometime after, they let him go. And he was without a job for 6 months. Now, that's actually a really common problem across the military. People who say are teachers in Texas and were married to a soldier and work in the Copperas Cove School District near Fort Hood, when they PCS to, say, Colorado, they may end up having to re-certify themselves as teachers with the state. Lawmakers have been trying to fix that problem, but it's not something that's easily done. It's not being done universally because all the powers that are not specifically given to the federal government are reserved to the states. That would be the 10th Amendment. Every state has its own way of doing things, and not every state is going to be as supportive of the military as, say, Texas is. So you definitely have problems like that hurt families. And that basically means that one person is never going to really have a career. So if you have a 2-income family, the first problem you have is just getting a job so you can earn money. But if you've got a career where you might be a manager or you might be a district manager, like the husband in this case, he could be a district manager or he manages a number of stores at once. But he's probably never going to get a shot at doing that because they move so often. These are real problems across the military, and some of them the Rand report and the Air Force will be able to fix where women are concerned. Some of the others, like what happens to you when you move every 3 years, that's going to take a lot more time to fix. And across the country, you have families living the dream, I guess you'd call it. They have 3 or 4 kids in some cases. They have 2-income families working, and they're serving their country, but they're also struggling, and it's a very difficult thing to see. Some of it is endemic to our society. I mean, I think that we all recognize that we have daycare center problems, specifically that there aren't enough of them, but how do you fix it? And when you've got people who are pilots and they're defending their country and they're under orders, or you've got a guy out there who's a medic in the Army, and he has the same problem that the pilot does. You're moving every 3 years. You're having trouble with daycare. It's a tough nut to crack, and I think that most people in America just have no idea. But at least the Air Force is trying. They have recognized the problem here, and they really recognize the importance of trying to keep women in the force.
And of course, you do as well. And that's why we have this podcast, Military City, and specifically while we're talking about this topic today. So I appreciate the fact that, as I mentioned, at the top of the show, both men talking about specifically, how children and childcare affect women. But as you just pointed out, obviously, many times there's a father in that situation as well who can be negatively affected. So a very important topic. And of course, I appreciate you bringing it to the podcast. We'll talk to you again about 2 weeks from now, Sig. And as always, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.